Hello, this is my new version of the Equipping Armor and Clothing in Unity 3D tutorial. In the last one, I didn't supply you with the scripts. I made you sort of type them all out. And that's not because I'm evil. That's because, well, two reasons. First of all was that I was using GameGrind's inventory scripts. Um, so I was worried about releasing those if there was any problems, if he wouldn't be happy with that. But I think I've changed them enough so that shouldn't really be an issue anymore. Especially the things like the item data script, I've changed heaps. Inventory, I've added other things to. The item database is my own, that sort of thing. So they all of these items I've created. So I don't think it's too bad to release them. I've also asked him if it's okay, but I haven't heard back. So I'm just going to assume that it is okay. But every single script which I've got from his tutorials, I've put this little disclaimer at the top, and I show you where you can get the original script from. The other thing that's different is, yeah, so now I'm releasing all the scripts. And the other thing that's different is that the last tutorial was more about a very cursory overview of what each script did. But in this tutorial, it's going to be a step-by-step analysis of every single line of code. So it's not exactly suitable for the more advanced Unity practitioner, a Unity user, but for beginners it should be invaluable because I'm going to make sure that every single line of code makes sense. So it's going to be quite exhaustive and there's going to be quite a lot of repetition probably, but hopefully it will help you understand how this all works. It's going to happen in 3 different videos. The first video I'm going to talk about how I actually create this inventory and these slots and that sort of thing, and how I create this the size of the inventory. The second one, I'm going to talk about how we add items to the inventory list. So that's here. Well, at the moment, no, there should, wait a minute. Yeah, so we'll talk about the inventory items list, and we'll also talk about the slots list. And then in the third video, what we're going to talk about is the drag and drop feature. So how we drag items around in here, and then how we equip items onto the character by dragging into these equipment slots. So let's get started. So let's talk about the inventory size and how I get it to be this size and that sort of thing. And yeah, this bit here isn't very good. You can see the difference here is that these are changing dynamically according to your screen resolution at the start of the game. But these ones are not. They're just a set size no matter what. I couldn't really find a way to change these dynamically because of their size. They're irregular. These ones it's quite easy to change dynamically. You can even create this component here. So those are a child of the slot panel. You put this grid layout group and ensures that all its children are 46 by 46 and they have a spacing of 3 by 3. And there's a bunch of other stuff you can do as well. So that's really easy to change those dynamically. It's harder when you have irregular shapes. So the head was one shape, then the torso and the legs were different shapes as well, and they're in an awkward position in the center of the game object, which in this case was the character, which is a child of the equipment panel. So yeah, I guess I haven't spent much time trying to solve that yet, so you can try and work that one out if you like, or I'll solve it later. But for now, let's have a look at how I did the rest of it. So first of all, if you go to the player inventory script, the player inventory script inherits from inventory, and there are these variables here: inventory panel, inventory slot, and inventory item. And that's what we're initializing here by loading in those things from the resources folder. So you can see all of those here. This is what we just looked at before. This is the equipment panel, inventory panel, item slot, and slot panel. Now what do we do with those? So we've initialized those variables, and then we do these 3 methods here. We instantiate the inventory. We set the inventory position and size based on the screen resolution when you start the game. It doesn't dynamically change if you change a resolution during the game. Which, I don't really want to add a functionality for that because I don't really see why you'd want to change the resolution mid-game. Normally when I've played games, you change the resolution at the start of the game, it goes black, then you go back to it again, and then you play. So it's going to be more like that. And then you create the slot. So let's talk, the purpose of this tutorial is to explain these 3 methods and how they work. So let's start with the instantiating the inventory. So let's go through them step by step. We'll start with the instantiate inventory method. So what that does is it sets this variable player to be this game object, and we'll talk about why that's important soon, maybe in the next video. I'm not sure if that's relevant just yet. Then we set the slot amount to 24. So slot amount is a variable stored in the inventory script, and what that's all about is it puts a limit on how many slots you can create in the inventory. So if I set this to 6, See, there's exactly 6 slots now as opposed to the 24 that were there before. That's what that's doing. Let's set it back to 24 again. Now here what we're doing is we start instantiating these variables that we initialized in Awake, all of these things. So we instantiate the inventory panel, and then we set its parent to be the canvas, and we call it inventory, and then we find its child. So if you're not familiar with this here, it's really something I should talk about in a separate video, more kind of an introduction to basic Unity methods and that sort of thing. But basically what this is doing is it's going to the inventory panel, it's finding its first child, and then it's finding the first child of that child, which in this case is a text, has a text component, and then we're changing that text to be the name of the game object which the script is attached to, plus apostrophe s, plus inventory. So let's go through that again and I can show you what's happening. Let's not maximize on play. Right, so you can see that this is what it's getting, and it's calling it units inventory. There's the apostrophe s and inventory. I want to show you what's happening step by step. So go into the canvas and we'll go into inventory. This is the inventory panel. This is the thing that we changed its name to inventory to. And you can see that it made its parent the canvas as well. Right, that's its parent. Then it goes into the first child of the inventory, which is this thing called inventory title. And then from there it goes into the first child of inventory title, which is this text. And it's the text that we changed here. That's what we're changing there by going into blah 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 dot text, and then we change it to this here. Now alternatively, another way I could have found this is just by going to transform find child inventory, find child inv title, transform find child text dot get component text dot text equals blah blah. So let's see if that works. Hey, so it works the same way, but the reason why I do it this way is because normally if you don't know where a child is going to be, like for instance if you've instantiated stuff at runtime and into something, you made it a parent of a certain object, then you want to find that child, you might not know exactly where it is in the list, in the children of that object. So then this is normally the method that you use. But when you know exactly where the child is in the list, so child 0 means the first child in the list of children, it's probably better just to do that. I can imagine it would be more memory efficient. Instead of having to search through a list, you could just go exactly to the index where that child is contained. So this is probably better. Let's get rid of all of that. I'm just showing you that's an alternative way to get there. Okay, then we set active to true. So the inventory panel, this is normally what we do for setting game objects on or off. And what that does, if we set this to false, it's probably going to create a bug because I think it needs to be active at the start for everything to work. You set that to false. It's not there, but it is there. You can see here it's just turned off, right? So if you set it to true, it turns on. You set it to false, it turns off. That's it. Works for most game objects. Equipment panel, set active. Actually works for all game objects. It just doesn't work for components, I don't think. Okay, so then we go into this one here. We do much the same thing, but for this, oh, we don't. This is different. The slot panel is then made a child of this inventory panel. So we just did all the same thing for the equipment panel. That's the one right next to it. And we want to set that to true again. Then we do the same thing for the equipment panel. The same logic applies as up here. And then we create the slot panel. We instantiate that. We make its parent the inventory panel here. And then we set its position to be the inventory panel position. I'll show you where that is. This is in the inventory. Oh, that's still off. Why is that still off? I didn't build it. Here. And that's it's hard to, well, it's impossible to see because the slot panel is actually invisible, but it contains all these slots which have a graphic associated with them, but not the actual slot panel itself. What I also might do is change the name. I don't like the word clone, it's annoying. So I'm going to change that name, slot panel dot name equals slot panel. Yeah, now it's slot panel instead of slot panel clone. The reason why it's called clone, if you're not aware of instantiating things, whenever you instantiate something, it's the game object name plus clone in brackets. Oh, hello, what's that? Wow, okay, when demonstrating, making a comment. Plus clone. And it's annoying. So just the way you get rid of that is that once you've instantiated the object, you make the name yourself manually, whatever you want it to be. So that's what I've done every single time and here as well. So that's the instantiate inventory. We now have it instantiated, but if all we did was instantiate the inventory, look what happens. So let's get rid of that, and let's get rid of that. So this, though, at least we can see how far this gets us along the way. So obviously the position is wrong. That's still off, damn it. Oh, no, of course, they're just stacked on top of each other. Okay, yeah, so they're hiding. They have exactly the same position, everything's the same. In terms of their width and their height, how is that being set? The width and the height is just the width and the height that they came with. So these are game objects, these are prefabs that I'm instantiating from the UI folder. So their width and their height is set, and it won't change dynamically according to the size of the screen. So right there, they're that big, but then if I maximize on play, they're still exactly the same size, right? They're not changing according to the screen resolution you have when you start the game. So that's the next method we're going to uncover. This one. Okay, inventory position and size. So then we scroll down and we're here. So first of all, what I do is create a vector2 variable called panel size. And let's talk about what's happening here. So vector2 is not the same as vector3, obviously, and a vector2 is about 2D space. So it has a y and an x coordinate, and that's your position based on the x and y coordinate. And then we can create this with, we only need 2 variables. We don't need 3 variables like a vector3. What this is doing is saying I want the x variable to be the screen width divided by 6. So 1/6 of the screen width. I want the y variable to be half of the screen height. But to show what this is doing, let's just get rid of those and see what happens when I just have screen width on x and screen height on y. Wow, so it's taken up the entire screen, right? So this is the inventory panel or something. Anyway, it's taken up everything. Well, everything gets that size, so let's not maximize on play so it's not be overwhelmed by inventory panel. So it's taken up exactly the size on the width and exactly the size on the height. So this is the inventory here, and so it looks like I've got a resolution of 1033 by 591. Equipment panel is the same. Everything will be the same because everything's being given this size, so that will be the same as well, and that sort of thing. Right, so we obviously don't want something that big. That's going to make it impossible to play the game. So instead what we can do is we can do the width to be 1/6 and the height to be 1/2. And now you could imagine this being, if you just put another one here, you'd be like half the way there, then another 2, another 3, you cover the whole thing with exactly 6 panels. And then half of this. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate that. And see, it's exactly half the screen height. Yep. Okay, so that should make sense. I'll try not to, flog a dead horse and go too long into these little details, but I'd rather make... It'd be great if I could see you and talk to you, and then I'd gauge exactly when you understood a concept, like I do when I'm doing math tutoring or something like that. But I can't, so I probably might go into too much detail, worried that you won't get it from my cursory explanation. So next what we do is we go into the inventory panel, we get the component rect transform, and then there's a variable called size delta, and we change that to panel size. Now this is how you change the size. It's like the transform, but it's a rect transform. So it's not like the transform in 3D space, but it's a transform for a 2D UI element. A rect transform. I'll show you where that is. This is the rect transform, and this is what we're changing through this method. Oh wait. Yeah. We're changing the height and the width. And we're changing that to the panel size. So it's going to be half the screen in the height and 1/6 of the width of the screen in width. Then we do the same thing to the equipment panel. Then we go into the equipment panel and we find the child called character, and we also change that size to be this variable here. Then we go into the slot panel and we change that size. So the character, the slot panel, the equipment panel, the inventory panel are all this size. Then we have to set the position, because this will set the size, but if we don't set the position, they'll be down here at the bottom corner of the screen again. So remember that width and height is not the same thing as position. So we can have the same width and height, but we can have any position. See, like the position on the X is changing as I move it around. So now what we do is we set the position to be, what did I set that as? I did the panel size divided by 2 and the panel size Y divided by 2. Right. So first let's just look at what happens if we just have a vector 2 of 0 and 0. Now what this will do is this will set it to the bottom left of the screen. Down here. Okay, so let's have a look at that. This is the... Okay. Okay, so where that little circle thing is, what is that green? Oh, it's a terrain. Where that little circle thing is, that determines where this game object is, right? So if you move this over here, see the circle's moving. Now it's moving on X, but it's not moving on Y, because the Y is still at the 0. But then if you move it up, it's going to be changing on Y as well. So this is what determines where the actual game object is. So when it's at 0, 0, that's at the origin point there. Now, so obviously we don't want it to be here. We want it to be sort of there. But it turns out that this position here is half the width of the game object and half the height of the game object. So as you can see, it might be hard to see, but oh no, it should be pretty straightforward. You can see that here we're basically halfway there in terms of the Y. If we were to move up, if we were to move up that space again, we'd be in the right position on the Y. And we're also halfway there on the X. So if we're going to move over here, halfway again on the X, we'd be in the right position. So the way I'm dealing with that is I go here and I say, right, I want it to be the width of the panel size, but divided by 2. Panel size dot x divided by 2. I've already written this out. Panel size dot x divided by 2 and panel size dot y divided by 2, and that's how I got that position. Then I changed the inventory panel to that position, the slot panel to that position. Okay, so let's move on. So that's what this does. We changed the position of the inventory panel and the slot panel to be this variable here. Then we go down and we have this variable called padding. And the way I'm creating this variable is that I'm getting the slot panel, but I could have also got the inventory panel, because they're exactly the same size. They have, you know, as we mentioned before, they have exactly the same size, panel size. They're all panel size. And I could have even have just got panel size again. That would have worked too. Actually, that might be more elegant. Let's do that. Panel size dot x. We get the panel size and we multiply that by 0.05, which hopefully your pre-algebra is up to scratch. What that gives us is 5% of the panel size. So that's going to be our padding. Our padding is 5% of the panel size on X. It's probably a good idea for me to talk about what the grid layout group is before I try and explain it from here. The grid layout group has these variables of padding, top, bottom, left, and right, spacing, and cell size. So cell size is the size of the actual slot or whatever you're putting in there. The padding is the spacing around. Yeah, the padding is the spacing around the entire panel and everything that it contains. So you've got the top padding, the bottom padding, the left padding, and the right padding. And the spacing is the spacing between each of the cells. So let's have a look at that now. So we'll go into the inventory component and go into slot panel, and you'll see that there's this grid layout group. And what the grid layout group does is it's got the cell size and it's got that spacing variable that we saw before. And these should change depending on the screen resolution when you start. So let's have a look again. Let's pause that, go into inventory, slot panel again. Yeah, so now it's 90 by 90 and these are 8 by 8. So depending on your screen resolution when you begin the game, yeah, now it's 28 by 28 and it's 2 by 2. So that's what it's doing. It's changing the cell size based on how wide and how high the inventory panel is, or the slot panel is. So depending on, well, more particular, how wide and how high the slot panel is, right? That's what's happening there, and that's what that little thing does. It's very useful. And these are the variables that we're changing here. We're changing the padding, we're changing the spacing, and then we're changing the cell size, the size of the actual slots. So I encourage you to, I think it's going to take too long if I go through all of these in painstaking detail. So what I encourage you to do is use that similar technique that I did before, like jump in here and change stuff. So jump in here and change this to like 50, and then make all this, comment that out, and see what happens. Oh, well, you can't change it to 50, you've got to change it to a vector 2. So let's change it to a new vector 2. 50, 50. So now, no matter what, the cell sizes will always be 50 by 50, no matter what the rest of it is doing, which is not ideal. You know, we want it to change according to what's happening with the panel size, so it changes dynamically. It's always going to be 50 by 50 now. So instead of doing that, what I've done is I've made it more dynamic. So the padding will always be 5% of the width of the panel size. The spacing will always be half of the padding size on both X and Y. And then this one, oh shit. And then, oh, it's exactly the same thing again. What the hell? And then you can have a look at what's happening here on this for the cell size for X. What I've done is I've gone into the slot panel, and I could just use panel size again. I think it's going to help with understanding what's going on here. So I want it to be a square, so they're both exactly the same size. So the panel size divided by 3 minus the padding, and then panel size divided by 3 minus the padding. So it's going to be a square with even padding around it. And get rid of you, we don't need you. Okay, so next what we're doing, set the equipment panel to be the same as the inventory, but twice as far to the right on X. That's a helpful little comment, I think. So the equipment position, notice before we dealt with the inventory panel position, the slot panel position, but not the equipment panel position, because I want the equipment position to be the panel pos, which was this variable here, but then I want it to be on X, it needs to be twice as far to the right on X. And then we'll set the equipment panel position to be equipment pos. So if you don't do that, then it's going to be exactly on top of each other. So you want it to be twice as far to the right on X, and then you'll have this sort of thing. Equipment and inventory. Otherwise, the equipment will be exactly on top of the inventory, and that's not what you want. Okay, again, play around with that and see what happens so you can get a deeper sense. Ultimately, the best way for you to learn how this works is for you to play around with these numbers and experiment. But I just want to give you sort of an introduction to what's going on. Sort the inventory and equipment titles out, right? So I'm going to find the child. So this time I've gone for that alternative method. Instead of going get child 0, I've gone and done this instead. But for the reasons I said before, it probably makes sense to do get child 0, and then get its rect transform and change it to be 70% of the size on X, and then I've got a constant value here, a magic number, which is just 30 on Y. So I wonder why I've done that, because theoretically that wouldn't work very well. You'd imagine that what you'd want instead... Oh, wait a minute, this is the... Yeah, okay, this is the size, it's not the position. Even so, that's not dynamic. This variable isn't dynamic, it's going to be 30 no matter what on Y. Which is at the end of the world? Anyway, let's move on. So inventory title position, so then we make it inventory title position.x is the panel pos.x, which is fine. And then inventory position.y is panel pos.y plus inventory panel get component rect transform.rect height. Oh wow, I'm not sure what I did here. Divided by 2 plus 30. What the hell? And why did I do 30 divided by 2? Why did I just do 15? Okay, so anyway, this is obviously some hacky code. It's not great code, and I encourage you to improve it and make it better yourself. So now, but it kind of works, I guess. It's just really ugly. So inventory panel.transform find child. So let's do that other one. Child 0. And then we set its position. Not brilliant code, and we do sort of similar rubbish here. So that can definitely be improved. Right, so that explains that, I hope. I hope that makes more sense to you how all of this stuff works. Now let's move to the final method, which is create slots. The create slots method just has a for loop and nothing else. And what the for loop does is it iterates through slot amounts, in this case it's 24, so it's going to go through 24 times, and in each iteration, first what it does is it adds a new item to the inventory items list, and it adds a new slot to the inventory slots list. So first let's make sure that we understand what this means. We'll go into the inventory script, and you'll see that there's these two lists. There's an item list, a list of items, and that's the inventory items, and then there's a list of game objects, and that's the inventory slots. Go here, and this is where we create those lists. This is where we populate those lists. So for the inventory items, what we do is we go and add a new item and see how it's got an empty constructor. This corresponds to this constructor here. We have constructors for weapons, constructors for clothing and armor, and for world items, like things you pick up in the world. And for having no equipment at all, there'll be more constructors later on for like consumables and a whole bunch of different things. But for now, this is the constructors that we have, and we have this empty constructor, which all it does is it sets the item ID to -1. The item ID, have a look at the item database where these items are actually sort of initialized or created. The item ID is this here. So if you hover your mouse over item, you can see what each of the things are. So the first one is the item ID. And the constructor, all it does is it sets the ID to -1. So none of these will have an ID of -1. The lowest ID will be 0, then everything else will be greater than 0. So if you have an ID of -1, it means you're empty. That's just one way of finding out that the item you're dealing with is an empty item. And then you can see this in action if we play the game. Here, right? So we have the inventory items list has 24 items in it, and they're all the same in that they exist as items. You know, it is a list of 24 items, but each item is just an empty item. And the reason we do that is so we can easily change the elements instead of having to add them again at runtime and do all sorts of things. They exist as 24 items, and then we can just swap them out at runtime. And here are the inventory. This is the inventory slots list. What we do here, because this is a list of game objects, so what we do is we instantiate the inventory slot. And if you remember, inventory slot is this variable here, which loads in this variable here. And what this has is it contains this. It's just a UI element, it's a panel, I think. and it contains a slot, the slot script. So it instantiates this inventory slot and then adds it to this inventory slots list. Then we want to go into that inventory slots list, so at index, in this case 0 if you're at the very beginning, and change the name to empty slot. If we don't do this, it's going to be called something weird. So let's just see what happens if we don't do this. It's going to be called something clone because we've instantiated it. Yeah, slot clone. We don't want that. So instead we're going to call it empty slot because that's what it is. It's a slot which doesn't contain any items. And then we go here and we go into that slot script that I showed you before. There's a variable called player and we change that to this game object. And what that means is that in the player inventory script is attached to the unit, to the player that we're interested in. And so if we say that player equals this game object, we're saying that the player equals this very thing here, this guy who has this inventory. Now why am I doing that? The reason why I'm doing that is I need some connection between the slot and the player, because at the moment what we're doing is we're instantiating the slots into the inventory. Let me just show you again. We're instantiating the slots into the inventory slot panel, but the inventory slot panel and the unit are separate game objects and there's nothing really connecting them. So I can't, for instance, go from the slot script and go, okay, find parent unit. I won't. The parent is going to be the inventory, and then the parent of that's going to be the canvas. The unit has nothing to do with this game object. So in order to create that link between the slot and the unit, what I have to do is have a variable in there called player, and then I set that player to be the unit, the person who the player inventory script is attached to. So now we can find out who the player is, and that's really important for later on. Then what we do is we set the parent to the slot panel.transform, so the parent of the slot is going to be the slot panel. And then finally we set the slot ID to be the index that we're at. So if we're right at the beginning, the slot ID is going to be 0. Then if we're second, it's going to be slot ID of 1. And let me show you that as well. So for instance, right, we're at the start of the slot panel, so the slot ID is 0, then we go down, the slot ID is 1, and so forth, 2, 3, as we go down, the slot ID increases according to what iteration we're in the for loop. And that's it. Hopefully that made sense. That's how we create these slots. In the next video, I'll talk about how we actually add items to the inventory. Okay, thanks for watching.